Greetings and welcome to Talk a Little, Learn a Lot, the American Society of Naval Engineers podcast. I am your host, Stephen Phillips. In this podcast, we talk a little and learn a lot about naval engineering while inspiring the next generation of STEM professionals. Today, I'm joined by Rear Admiral Jim Shannon. Admiral Shannon is a returning guest. He joined me in episode 15 to discuss his views of ASNE and its future. For this episode, we will delve into the 5 shipbuilding questions that I asked of the guest during episode 50. And then we're going to delve into some questions about the plan to build a new class of nuclear-powered battleship and discuss other aspects of shipbuilding. Rear Admiral Jim Shannon was commissioned in 1981 with his classmates from the United States Naval Academy and began a seagoing career as a surface warfare officer. He commanded the USS Astotion, led a major program in PEO integrated warfare systems, and commanded a major command leading the NAVSEA Warfare Center enterprise with close to 20,000 personnel at the time. He was also a deputy commander at NAVSEA and a deputy assistant secretary of the Navy overseeing international programs. Since retiring from active service in 2016, Jim has served in private industry, continuing his leadership in Navy technology. Rear Admiral Shannon, Jim, welcome back to the show, sir.
Hey, Steve, it's great to be here.
Well, let's start with those 5 questions. I really enjoyed going through these in episode 50. And so when we prepped for this one, I said, let's go through these again. And so I appreciate you addressing each one of these. So the first one is there an argument to return to shipbuilding at the public shipyards?
Well, I think in purely American culture terms, there's always an argument, right? I think we really cut to the bone in the history of our public yards when we got down to the 4 yards we have today. There was a time, and not too long ago, I can remember when I was a young officer, we had multiple public shipyards, and the management of the Navy and the size of that Navy at the time, the idea of building in a public yard made good sense. And there was a lot of talent in the public yards where you could put shipbuilders and really compare and contrast a public yard performance to a private yard performance in terms of the quality of the work as well as to the cost and the management of the build. But now we're at 4 shipyards, and with the national need to make sure our ships are ready, that's the priority in the Navy, is ship readiness. It's a trade-off that I wouldn't recommend today, okay? I think a larger argument for Congress in this kind of situation is, do we want to start building public yards again? There's some old yards which would take a lot of love and care to bring them back to life. I know there's a lot of talk in the state of California with the Mare Island Naval Shipyard, for example. And the company I'm in, we've actually went out. There's a small private company that works in the old Mare Island Naval Shipyard. And, the stuff they're using is good, but there's a lot of wear and tear that has been ignored for decades. So there's always an investment when you try to bring things back to life. But I think a bigger question for our country as a maritime nation is, what does that mean? And as a maritime nation, what is our responsibility in terms of shipbuilding, ship repair, and the like, and what should be public and what should be private? So yes, I think there is an argument, and I think it's going to take time to have that argument and a dedicated legislative oversight that goes beyond election cycles.
Second question, is the answer to our shipbuilding challenge found in startups?
So to be clear, what we're talking about in startups is like a new company that's coming into the business. So of course, a lot of people have been pointing fingers, I think unfairly, up in Wisconsin with where we were building LCS and the frigate. I think those accusations weren't necessarily good. There's been challenges down in the Gulf Coast with some of the companies that started up down there, and of course, there is a lot of tradesmen in that part of the country that can go back and forth between startups and established older companies. Um, Experience matters, right? You do need to have somebody who's been in the business um, and knows how to build things. I've never built a house. I'm a good leader, I think, maybe an average leader, and I could go see construction of a home, but I wouldn't know where to start. I wouldn't have the right framework, and I probably wouldn't do a good job building a house. My background is ship repair. I wouldn't necessarily be good at building a ship. So you have to have the right person, the right people who have the experience. And it's not so much the business oversight or the business model, it's getting the right people in place to do that sort of thing. So startups, sure. I know Hanwha's got some real talent that's come into the country up in Philadelphia. Uh, People have come from Korea, but they've hired some real American talent to run that business, people who know how to build ships, and we'll see how they do.
Third question: do we keep building Burke-class destroyers?
Absolutely. Okay. And here's a little reason why I say that. We at one time decided to stop building that class. And when I was a senior officer at the beginning of this century, and I can't remember what year, but we stopped it and we stopped building the reduction gears and the stuff that makes up a ship, and that part of the shipbuilding. While ships were still being built, Arleigh class, they were not building the things you need for future Arleigh class, and the lines went cold. And at the time, Secretary Winter was the Secretary of the Navy, and Admiral Gary Roughead was the CNO. And Admiral Roughead, as the top naval officer, he was one of the early people to command. I think he was the first person ever to command both a DDG and a CG, and have all that Aegis background. He's very familiar with the class of ship, and there was a lot of investment going into the DG 1000, which was no one really knew how that was going to play out. We were investing in LCS, and he was looking at, hey, we're just breaking the system when we really need to keep just building these things and evolving them over time. That was his decision. I'm sure Secretary Winter as well. And then they got Congress involved, and it was a really hard restart. But look what you got now in the class and how well it's going. And the NAVC team that's working with the industry are really building beautiful ships. I don't think there's a better ship class in the world. And I would continue doing that. And then the decision has to be, how do we evolve that into whatever the next class is going to be? You got to keep the lines warm. You got to keep the workforce. Where there's this sense of urgency now that we're losing tradesmen. Well, if you keep starting and stopping your shipbuilding programs, yeah, people are going to go do something else. And so we got to be smart about it.
Can you tell me about a shipbuilding challenge that's not receiving enough attention?
Yeah, I think, again, using the framework and understanding of us as a maritime nation and understanding what's going around the world, we have an opportunity to be real leaders in unmanned shipbuilding, okay, or partially manned shipbuilding, and we have an opportunity to build a lot of them, okay, and I would say today is the time that we should be looking at the Liberty class program of 2026. That all started pre-World War II, but it was the same kind of conditions for the country at that time. There wasn't a large shipbuilding capability around the country, and they really needed to build a lot more ships. That's where we are today. And the way they did it back then is what we got to do today. And it's not getting the discussion. No one's really looking at the history there. In fact, maybe we might have a question later on where I can kind of address that history. But I think now's the time that we really, as a nation, need to put a lot more into the unmanned capability. It's the 21st century time to do these things. And it could bring a lot of, it could really help the economies around the country, the local regional things. It's a good investment.
The fifth question, the last of the first five. If you were asked to brief a member of Congress on how to best improve shipbuilding, what would you tell them?
Well, I tell them to cut some checks. All right. Um, our Congress right now is, the elephant in the room is our Congress right now is a bit dysfunctional. Okay. And they're protecting their own equities, and it's just the way things are today. And we got to get beyond that. And they need to understand that it takes money to build that maritime industry trade. In pre-World War II, that we had a maritime commission that was building ships. It wasn't the executive branch overseeing it. A commission by our government laws and standards is led by the legislative branch, where a department is led by the executive branch. We all learned that seventh grade civics, but I think people forget it. And we probably need a commission that has the authority to spend money. And pre-World War II, it wasn't cheap. They threw down a lot of money, and they gave a lot of high fees so that companies could thrive. And it brought a lot of companies together, and they were able to surge and then really respond as the war was going on. And they're not doing that today. Okay, they're not cutting the checks. And then post World War II, the shipping industry continued to thrive because it was subsidized. And so when you compare and contrast the United States to other countries, and there's a lot of, questions, why is Korea better than us at shipbuilding? Why is another country maybe better than us? Well, those countries their governments subsidize their industry. And so for our country, it's not just about ships, it's about making an economy work, making the people in the country work, and all that effort of bringing people to work and get a capability. It's good for the country, it's good for the economy, and it's good for individuals who feel good about what they're making. And right now, it's just, dysfunctional in Congress, and they're not listening to the history lessons that we learned a long time ago.
Let's shift to a new question then, talking about the battleships. This has been a big topic of conversation, and I've been seeing folks assert, BBGN, battleship, guided missile, nuclear. Jim, what's your take?
There's a lot of pundits out there. Initially, what happens when you bring up battleship, people think about whatever old battleship they went on and took a museum tour of, and they're impressive even to this day when you go up to see the Massachusetts, or you go down in Norfolk and go on to Wisconsin, and you see these incredible structures. I don't think that's what we're talking about today in terms of a battleship, and with the giant guns and everything else like that. Really, what you're trying to understand is in the way that we use our Navy today, there is a need for a fighting ship that has weapons on it to be able to do something. And what is that something that's needed? Where the imbalance is in our Navy today is we have a nuclear aircraft carrier fleet, and all the supporting ships are conventionally powered. And so we're underutilizing our aircraft carriers. They are slowed down to get from point B because they got to let the conventional ships stay with them. They could go much faster and get places much faster, but they can't do it without the escorts. And if you had a battleship that was nuclear powered, you could take the aircraft carrier and one battleship, and now you got a fighting force. You don't need to have 5 or 6 ships. You just have one properly armed ship with the same kind of power plant. That makes sense. Now, there's a lot being talked about the aesthetics of the battleship, and the president is talking about what he's drawing in his designs and all that. that's, you know, that's hubris, really, when you think about it. Really, what we need is professional engineers to look at what's existing, what's possible, and what are we trying to accomplish with the battleship. And there is a need, in my opinion, to have a warship that's not an aircraft carrier that can escort a carrier and provide that extra defense for it to do its mission and go anywhere in the world very fast and respond to anything at a really fast speed. So yes, I do see that. Now, the question with the battleship is not just the hull thickness or things that people like to talk about from old battleships. Is you just can't, spit out a nuclear power plant. So how are we going to do that? I think the lesson learned is, I remember when we built the AOE class back in the day, and they needed a power plant for that. Now, they were conventionally powered, but they took plants that were being built for the battleships that they were stopped building. And I remember the USS Kentucky power plant went on one of the first AOEs. So that was a smart design. That was very smart that the engineers did that sort of thing. We are building nuclear power plants for aircraft carriers right now, okay, for whatever it is. We may need to look at taking a power plant that's being designed for an aircraft carrier and putting it into a battleship. Now that's a lot easier said than done. But I think you could scale that. And I do think that's in the art of the possible.
Navy shipbuilding programs often get into a negative bind with the first ship in the class. How would you guard against those pitfalls?
I've never served on a first in the class, and I've never been in the shipbuilding part of the Navy. I've only been a witness to it, and I've been in a lot of meetings, so I've heard a lot of stuff, and the different finger pointing that happens in these things when you get into that crisis mode. Why are they having all these problems? Let me tell the story for the listening audience about the LCS class, right? LCS class had a lot of problems. Now, the initial idea with the LCS class to start with, what the need was, we had 3 aging classes of ships. We had the FFG class, the Perry class frigate that was aging out. We had the minesweeping class that was aging out. And then we had a coastal patrol PC class, I think it was called Cyclone class, that was all aging out. All of them had very good missions. And the idea was, maybe there's a way to, using open architecture concepts, to consolidate these missions onto one class, and then they would all be reconfigured depending on what the need was. So an LCS one day could be focused on literal missions and doing anti-submarine warfare, or you could reconfigure it, you could go do minesweeping in the Arabian Gulf. It was a good idea, right? And so then the idea at this time was, hey, let industry figure this out. Don't let NAVSEA get involved. Let industry figure it out, and not only that, let's take it down to a competition, and then we're going to have a bake-off, and I use that with air quotes, between 2 different designs. So that became the LCS-1 design and the LCS-2 design, 2 different companies, and the idea was they were going to compete against each other. All of that was going real well. At the beginning of that design, as NAVSEA engineers came in to kind of inspect and see what was going on, they were seeing that neither one of those original designs was really meeting the standards of a warship for the U.S. Navy based on mil specs and things like that. So they got involved, they started changing the requirements midstream, and that just slowed everything up. And then there became a giant, food fight and argument, and everything got delayed, and money was thrown at this thing. And as I look at that problem, and I was witnessing it, I was the executive assistant in the Pentagon at the time, and I got to be a fly on the wall in a lot of meetings. My question was always, why don't you just stay with the original plan? Let these first 2 ships that were designed by industry, let them design them and launch them and everything, and then tell industry, you know what, you didn't do a good job, but we'll have 2 ships that came out fast and affordable, and we learned from that. And you could use those 2 ships for a number of missions. You could give it to a different part of government to use for science and technology, or you could use it for training midshipmen. There's many ways you could have used those 2 affordable ships if they had followed the original plan, and they didn't. They got involved and they slowed it up. So to answer your question, you got to let the original idea percolate. And if it turns out to be just not a capable ship or something we don't like, then you just, while you realize that's happening, you say the next 2 ships need to have this change, and you need to do it in an affordable way, and you got to meet a schedule, and you just keep amping up the requirements, not for the ones that are being built, for the next ones. And that's okay. And then you're going to get something more affordable, and you're going to build the ships, and you're going to get things out on time. I think the government really messed up in the LCS class. I think the government should have backed out of that and let industry see what they could design. Ultimately, I believe in private industry's ability to really give you what you want if you're clear what you're asking for. And we were clearly not, we were not clear on that. DDG 1000 was another thing. Really good concept, good idea. And there was a zillion different changes to that design as it was getting built, to the point that the Navy walked away from it out of frustration. So I think it's important to be willing to let the original idea play out. The Spruance class, which had tremendous amount of criticism when it first came out as being an underarmed destroyer, turned out to be a great ship as we allowed upgrades to the VLS edition, to the SQQ 89 edition, which were later in the design, not the original design. I remember the first time I went on a Spruance class, I was like, there's nothing on here, but boy, it's a beautiful ship. And then later on, there was a comm suite and real firepower on those ships at the time, at the end of their life, and they could have probably even lived a little bit longer. But the good news with the Spruance class is it really, that design led into the CG-47 class and the DEG-51. So that you could look at that as a real big success story.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
It's interesting when I look back at the history of shipbuilding, there was a time in the U.S. Navy where we would build a ship class and say, we're going to build 2 or 4 and see how they play out. And then we'll build the next class after that. We'll learn some lessons. And there's value in that, in my view. So yeah, that's a really interesting point. It's like, plan your dive your plan, and then, reassess and move to the next one. That's great. Great idea.
It's a real calculus problem. As we shrunk the industry and got down to less and less yards, you don't have some of that flexibility of yesteryear because we're not subsidizing industry. If you want Huntington Ingalls to be successful, or Bath Iron Works, or Fincantieri and all that, I mean, they're really been cut to the bone to be efficient. You can't play around too much with the plane. So it takes time. It takes time to build a ship, but government needs to be a little more patient with the design and seeing what industry builds.
How come timelines always get stretched in shipbuilding?
Well, along the lines of what I was just talking about is people that mean well change the plan. Okay. And it's not just shipbuilding, it's in ship modernization, ship maintenance too. That's an ongoing issue between private industry and government today, in that we don't plan soon enough to bring in the private industry. A big part of our industry is doing ship alterations and having different prime contractors come in and install whatever that system is. It's called AIT, right? Where you bring an alteration installation team in, and they're serving as a prime contractor. But they don't get tasked or get those awards till just a few months before A-0, when, the beginning of the availability. 4 months is really not enough time to plan. And then the other part of that is on the ship maintenance modernization side is our planning yards really do not do a good job keeping up the design prints, what's called government furnished information, do a poor job because they're not funded properly, they're not resourced properly. So they always seem to fall behind. And then when the when the companies come in to do something and they look at their, I'm saying talking old speak, but blueprints, they look at it and then they see it's not going to fit here because there's some structure already in the way. That should have been learned, a year ago. That shouldn't have happened just now. So, proper planning prevents poor performance. We hear that all the time, and I think that's why you have the problems, extension and delay. And part of proper planning is not changing your designs on the fly.
Yeah, indeed. Jim, what else would you like to share with the Talk a Little, Learn a Lot audience?
I think we have too much short-term memory in these discussions. We think of the last ship or the last time somebody was involved, and we don't really look back at history and try to understand what they did right and then redo it. I'm involved in many discussions, and I'll ask people, "Hey, when was the last time you read about the Maritime Commission and how they did it?" And no one even knows where to start. And there's an actual book. I have the book. It was printed by Johns Hopkins Press in the early 50s. Okay. After that successful industrial buildup, there was a lot of studies done by organizations like ASNE, SNAMI, and even places like Johns Hopkins, where they brought people in and said, what did we learn in this pre-World War II, World War II industrial powerhouse of a nation and what we did? And books came out. And if you go back and you read the stories, you find out a lot of things that make you question, what are we doing today? For example, I already talked about the Maritime Commission. But, the Maritime Commission started out as very much a political thing. It was really not trying to address the Navy shipbuilding industry. It was trying to address the shipping industry for, moving things back and forth. And they passed a law and said, we got to invest in it. And the first commissioner of the Maritime Commission was none other than Joseph Kennedy, who we know the Kennedy family history. And he was a guy that was not a shipbuilder. He was a rich guy who knew how to build businesses, but he had never built a ship, and he did poor. Okay, he did really poor in that, and they promoted him over to be the ambassador to the United Kingdom to get him out of town, which is what Washington does. And then they put in a guy who had a lot of experience building ships, a retired admiral named Emory S. Land. And Land came in and he brought in the people that he knew how to build ships. And then he reached out to private investors. The Elon Musk of the day was Henry Kaiser. Henry Kaiser had no shipbuilding experience, but he was a real industrialist. And he had a lot of money, and he knew he could figure out how to, one, help the nation and get even more rich. And that's okay. Okay. In a capital system, that is okay to do that way. And Kaiser came in and he changed some of the style and way of doing things. Today, our heavy investors are not really doing that. Elon Musk is more focused on ships going into space as opposed to the maritime thing. The country needs the maritime stuff. We don't necessarily need so much space stuff, but that's where he's at. Some of the other real rich people are very involved in their venture capital solutions, and those solutions are venture capital, which is a business model about winner takes all, and it's not necessarily a collaborative, collegial approach to solving a national strategic challenge like maritime building. All right, so you got to look at the history and openly and objectively say, what did they do differently? What are we doing differently? Maybe we could find a common ground to get there. I have on my desk, I'm looking at it. It's Ships for Victory, Shipbuilding under the U.S. Maritime Commission in World War II. And all the answers to the test are right there. And I'm surprised that we don't go back and try to understand those lessons learned. While we don't talk about the Liberty class program today and figure out, hey, we need the unmanned capability, but we need a Liberty class building model to do that. Nobody's talking that way. And I think it's folly not to. Okay, so that's kind of my bit. And those who have worked with me in the past, I always bring out historical narrative because it's objective, and it allows you to openly say, this is the baseline. Now, what do we want to change from history, as opposed to starting today and looking at the future and never looking in the past?
Well, now you've given me an idea for another episode, Jim. I think I'll have to read the book, and then maybe you and I join up again and have a conversation. So that sounds like a great idea.
It's hard to get copies. I got the used book, so you can, but they are available out there.
I'll have to scrounge the internet and find one. So, well, indeed, thank you, Rear Admiral Jim Shannon, for taking time to discuss first the 5 questions on shipbuilding, the next class of battleship, and then a few other questions about shipbuilding. I hope we can welcome you again back to the Talk a Little, Learn a Lot, the podcast of the American Society of Naval Engineers.
Thanks, Stephen, and thank you to the American Society of Naval Engineers, a great organization with great history, and I hope we get a lot more people joining.